Welcome to the latest in the series, Silicon Valley Talks from the Silicon Valley Archives. I'm Henry Lowood. I'm the Harold C. Hobach Curator, which means I'm responsible for the history of science and technology collections and the film and media collections and for the Silicon Valley Archives that you see around you. My role today is to introduce our speakers, Barbara Boissevain and Professor Elliott White Jr. They're going to tell us about the new book, Salt of the Earth, A Visual Odyssey of a Transforming Landscape, which was recently published by Kehrer Verlag. Many thanks also to Professor Nicole, oh, there you are, Nicole, to Professor Nicole Ardoin or Ardoin? Ardoin, okay, who will moderate the conversation. Before I get to the introductions, let me mention that we have copies of the book here. And if you'd like to purchase Salt of the Earth, and I think you can even get it signed, wait till afterwards and Barbara will take care of you. So let's start with Barbara for the introductions. Barbara Boissevain is a contemporary visual artist and photographer based in Palm Springs, California, whose work focuses on the impact of human activity on the environment. Nature's ability to regenerate and reclaim human-altered landscapes is a central theme in her work. Barbara was born in Cleveland and raised in Silicon Valley. She studied painting at Parsons School of Design in New York before earning a BFA from the San Francisco Art Institute and an MFA from San Jose State University. San Francisco Art Institute, I should have said RIP there, but anyway. Her work has been exhibited in solo and group exhibitions throughout the United States and Europe, as well as in public and private collections, including the Google Corporate Art Collection. Her first book, Children of the Rainbow, documented the humanitarian challenges facing Quechua communities in Peru due to climate change. Elliott White Jr. is an assistant professor of Earth System Science at Stanford. He's a coastal ecosystem scientist studying the effects of saltwater intrusion and sea level rise, which I learned is called Swizzler, SWISLR, on vegetation in the coastal land margin. His research experience in wetlands spans the North American coastal plain of the US, in addition to constructed prairie potholes in Iowa. His interdisciplinary approach to research draws from ecology, hydrology, biogeochemistry, and remote sensing. He's expanding his research to also understand the effects of Swizzler on humans living in the coastal zone. Swizzler is actually saltwater intrusion and sea level rise. This shows how pathetic I am when it comes to earth sciences. Elliott received a BS in biology and animal ecology from Iowa State University in 2015. And a Ph.D. in environmental engineering sciences from the University of Florida in 2019. For more information, visit coasts.stanford.edu, the website of the Doerr School's Wetlands Ecosystems Group. And last not least, there you are, Nicole, is our moderator today, Nicole Ardoin. Nicole is the Emmett Family Faculty Scholar and Associate Professor of Environmental Behavioral Sciences in the Division of Social Sciences in the Stanford Doerr School of Sustainability, the SDSS, as some of you may know it. She's also a senior fellow in the Woods Institute for the Environment. Professor Ardoin and her social ecology lab researches motivations for and barriers to environmental behavior at the individual and collective scales. Nicole is an associate editor of the journal Environmental Education Research, a trustee of the California Academy of Sciences, and chair of Nature Bridge's Education Advisory Council, among other areas of service within the environment and conservation field. And with that, I'm getting out of here and handing it over to Barbara.
Okay, thank you, Henry. Okay, so good afternoon. Thank you so much for this opportunity to speak to you today about my work here at Silicon Valley Talks. This is truly my backyard, and I am very honored, and I have a lot to share with you. So, I am the rare species of Californian that grew up in the Silicon Valley in a town that is now synonymous with a certain red fruit and the icon Steve Jobs. But I remember when the South Bay had thousands of orchards where my sister and I played in as children. And I would like to take a moment to mention that the Ohlone people were the first nation to live in the Bay Area and lived in harmony with this land hundreds of years before my ancestors set foot on this continent. My parents moved to California from the Midwest when I was 6 years old, and at that time, this part of the Bay Area was known as the Valley of Heart's Delight. As a child, I remember spending endless days roaming and building forts in the orchards with my friends. Even before the tech came to the valley, there were environmental issues as I played in these orchards, and I was unaware that they had been sprayed with DDT and other toxic chemical compounds. I grew up in tandem with the tech industry in the 70s and 80s, which was starting up all around us. My parents were both remarkable nerds. Don't ask me how they produced an artist. My dad was a Ph.D. who worked for NASA, and my mom was a math professor who became a computer programmer after moving to the valley. Despite my parents' love of math and engineering, they enrolled me in art lessons at local museums, including the De Young in San Francisco, where I started taking classes when I was 14, and it was there that I first saw the work of Richard Diebenkorn, whose aerial perspectives really spoke to me. I started to realize that I wanted to immerse myself in art and felt the need to experience life outside the technology bubble. And this is what propelled me like a rocket to New York, where I started at Parsons School of Design in 1988. I started out in art school primarily studying painting, but all of this changed in 1991 when on a trip to Paris, I saw Sebastião Salgado's exhibit Workers at the Palais de Tokyo. The idea of using photography in the service of social and political advocacy was not new to me, but this idea combined with the formal qualities of his images and his extraordinary use of available light really resonated with me. Discovering his work was a pivotal moment, and I wound up switching mediums and moving back to San Francisco to study photography at the San Francisco Art Institute. Like many people who grew up in the Bay, I boomeranged back to the Bay Area to settle down and raise my own family. And my real wake-up call to the environmental issues here in the Bay Area came in 2005 when I was living in Mountain View and 8 months pregnant with my second daughter, Giselle. I got a letter from the government informing me about a Superfund cleanup in my neighborhood. Superfund site is EPA lingo for contaminated and hazardous waste site. And at this time, I knew nothing about the toxic plume of carcinogen known as TCE or trichloroethylene that was underneath my home. Early on in the semiconductor industry, technology companies were using TCE as a solvent in chip manufacturing. And I set out to document and research vapor intrusion, the means by which air inside our homes becomes contaminated. While doing this research, I felt a little like Alice in Wonderland, where over and over again, I found myself going down another rabbit hole where people's lives had been upended by environmental toxicity. The San Francisco Bay Area leads the nation in environmental awareness, yet it is one of the most polluted regions in the country. In 2010, I started a body of work titled Big Dirty Secrets, which includes 3 main sites, all of which adversely impact the communities and ecosystems in their vicinity. The first site I documented is a cement factory in Cupertino that is located only 2 miles from my childhood home. In this series, I combine text and image in different ways, allowing the viewer to discover the text within these sites, mimicking the ways in which information about the true level of toxicity is obscured and hidden from the public. This text embedded in the image was excerpted from the EPA website, the San Jose Mercury News, and the Sierra Club. The Santa Cruz Mountains contain high levels of mercury dust, and it is this dust that is being stirred up during the extraction process when they remove the top layer of soil. There are clusters of lung cancer and birth defects in the neighborhood fence line with this community. This is basically the Stevens Creek watershed, and it goes all the way down from the Stevens Creek Reservoir into Mountain View and into the bay. Looking at the image on the upper left, you can see how close this cement factory is to the dense population on the other side of the ridge, where lies the headquarters of Apple Computers. While intriguing, the image on the right shows how scarred the earth is after the extraction of raw materials for cement. After decades of pressure from environmental activists, I'm happy to report that the factory will finally be shut down. And that took about 30 years of really active pressure. And they finally have a conservation group that has purchased that factory. Like many people who grew up in the South Bay, I have a shared history with Moffett Field, the largest Superfund site in California. Moffett Field is home to the iconic Hangar 1, a colossal structure that covers over 8 acres and is one of the largest freestanding structures in the world. As I mentioned earlier, my father worked for NASA as an aerospace engineer for over 33 years, and as a small child, I rode up and down in hot air balloons inside the hangar at the annual holiday parties. And I remember experiencing the incredible vastness of the space, known to produce its own weather systems, including rain and fog, rain and fog. I chose to title the series Ghost Hangar because of losing my father to a rare form of cancer in 2009. In 2010, Hangar 1 was found to be leaking chemicals into the San Francisco Bay, resulting in a biological die-off of the wetlands in close proximity with the hangar. The lower right is a shot of me in a 2-person helicopter when I went up to take aerial photos that show evidence of the toxic algae at the end of the runway next to the hangar. My next project was in the East Bay, where after hearing about the August 6, 2012 fire at the Chevron oil refinery that sent 15,000 people to the emergency rooms, I decided to spend 8 months with the community members documenting the lives of Richmond residents. Chevron paid $10 million to hospitals for responding to this disaster. Over the years, I've become aware of how oversaturated our social landscape is with images, which are ubiquitous on the sides of buses, in our social media feeds, and how people have become desensitized to so much photographic imagery. In this project, I wanted to get my photographs off the wall, and I chose to project images directly on the surface of oil into 50-gallon oil drums to serve as a visceral reminder of the toxicity this fence-line community lives with every day. In 2010, while flying over the bay in a helicopter to photograph my Big Dirty Secret series, I discovered something beautiful and quite magical happening in our bay. After years of investigating toxicity, I was thrilled to find an opportunity to document something positive happening in our environment. For over a decade now, I've been photographing the South Bay Salt Pond Restoration, the largest wetlands restoration program on the West Coast. After 13 years working on this project, my book, Salt of the Earth, was published by Kehrer Verlag in fall of 2023 and released at Paris Photo. I consider this project my love letter to the San Francisco Bay. These aerial shots are of industrial salt ponds that have existed in the South Bay since the mid-1800s, and they are characterized by environmentalists as having taken away the lungs of the bay. For over 100 years, they were used to produce salt for icy roads and other industrial purposes, and the San Francisco Bay is home to some of the oldest and densest urban settlements in the American West. These mountains of salt are produced in a series of evaporation ponds that trap the bay's salt water. As the salt water evaporates, large earth-moving equipment is used to extract the salt. Cargill, the main producer of salt in the Bay Area, is capable of crystallizing over 500,000 tons of salt each year. The map on the left shows us how small family-run salt farms started harvesting salt in the Bay after the gold rush in the 1850s. But even before this influx of Europeans, the Ohlone people harvested salt from naturally occurring tide pools by leaving willow branches in the submerged salt water and then waiting for salt to crystallize on the submerged branches. Unfortunately, when the Spanish arrived in the 1700s, they enslaved the Ohlone to produce salt for export to Europe. Here are some of the vestiges from the salt pond industry that I captured a year ago when I got lucky after flying into SFO from Palm Springs to speak at an event at the Randall Museum. I was excited and surprised that there was a respite from the rain, and I convinced my friend Marlene, who's actually in the audience, she's a retired Stanford employee, who picked me up to go and take photographs in Eden Landing, which is over in Hayward on the east side of the bay. And this was, a really remarkable site that I highly recommend you visiting if you, putting it on your list. There are ruins from the salt pond industry going all the way back, over 100 years that you can walk around and enjoy the wildlife. In addition to the industrial salt extraction, the bay was basically used as a dump for many decades, where anything and everything was unloaded and dumped into the bay. During my 13 years photographing this project, I came across everything from old tires and car engines to refrigerators and other appliances. The green and yellow areas in this map of the south portion of the San Francisco Bay show areas that have been or will be restored back to natural wetlands. So it's a significant portion of the South Bay. The orange area is where Cargill will continue to produce salt in the East Bay. So they'll still have, I think it's about 1,000 acres that they'll be producing salt. Photographing this project for more than a decade, I've captured thousands of images and have learned quite a bit about the limited biodiversity that is a result of the high salinity of these ponds. The apocalyptic oranges and blood orange reds are from the carotenoids produced by a specific algae, as well as a salt-loving halobacteria that thrives in this high salinity environment. Several years into the project, I began creating formal grids based on the year they were photographed and a common color palette. I used the grid to reshape the landscape and transform it into something new. This reconfiguration emphasizes the surreal nature of these sites already altered and deformed by human activity. I found these landscapes surreal to begin with, and the grid structure acts as an amplification. The greening of the bay, visible in the right grid, happens rather quickly after levees built to create the ponds are broken and tidal systems are let back in. The biodiversity increases from just 2 organisms to tens of thousands in just a matter of months when the tides are allowed to repopulate these areas. In 2020, during the pandemic, I began photographing from the ground level several of the salt ponds that are under active restoration. The Ravenswood ponds in Menlo Park are adjacent to the headquarters of Meta, where technology workers look out of these ponds from windows of slick glass buildings, and many of them are not aware of the miraculous transformation that's taking place in their own backyard. The yellow pedestrian bridge that you see in the upper left image is actually was designed by the architect Frank Gehry, and I was really interested in this juxtaposition of the dystopian landscape and the deconstructivist architecture. While photographing, my experience of the colors and textures of this already surreal landscape was heightened after what seemed like many months of sensory deprivation during the pandemic. These images reveal human incursions in the landscape, resulting in complex geometries and artifacts due to the limited biodiversity. Zooming in closer to my subject allowed me to reveal the wound-like openings in the earth where signs of new life are just beginning under the surface of the water. Nature reclaiming its territory is a potent theme for me and one that I explore in other photographic series. my project evolved further when I decided to photograph with a macro lens. And this image looks like it has ice or snow as if in the Arctic, but it's actually a saltscape and is only a few centimeters high. In May of 2022, I began photographing the Ravenswood Pond underwater and discovered a microcosm infused with hidden beauty and structure. These images uncover a new universe where salt crystals have iterated into congruent forms, creating a foreign landscape. The salt-encrusted shoreline, only a few centimeters high, now suggests these mountains of ice and snow. Submerging my camera underwater reveals brine shrimp swimming around the cavernous berg-like salt crystals. Within this immersed world, I was intrigued to find textures and patterns mirroring the ones I had captured when photographing from the air. When photographing in the ponds, I took a friend with me, and usually because a lot of times I would get stuck in the actual salt-encrusted ponds, and basically underneath this hardened crust layer of salt is a mud layer that's like quicksand. And as I unfortunately found out, I had to be popped out of this primordial soup like a champagne cork a couple times, and it was not very glamorous. And some of my friends who were here were there to witness that. So. As the salt ponds are being restored back into tidal marshes, salt marshes, their biodiversity is exponentially increasing. This is an aerial shot of a restored salt marsh where I've included several examples of wildlife that is coming back as a result of the restoration. These include jackrabbits, leopard sharks, and burrowing owls. Endangered species are coming back as well, including the western snowy plover and the salt marsh harvest mouse. I decided to dedicate the book to the shorebirds who pass through the San Francisco Bay, which is one of the key rest stops for the migratory birds on the Pacific Flyway, which extends from Alaska to Patagonia. Over 1 million birds stop over every year, and they are out there, screeching and partying it up. And I was commuting across the Dumbarton Bridge every morning to teach in the East Bay, and I would basically unroll my windows and I could hear them just like, having such a good time out there. And sometimes I would pull over because these birds do these murmurations that are just, if you haven't seen them, you are missing out. They're so cool. And people would, pull over with me and we'd watch these incredible shows that the birds did. So why is this project important for us now when we are constantly bombarded with negative news about the environment? I think it's easy to doubt our own agency. And through wetland restoration, communities do have the ability to protect themselves from climate change and sea level rise. Nature has the ability to regenerate and renew when given a chance, and what is happening in our bay can serve as a model for other coastal communities faced with the same existential crisis. I'm in awe of the fact that leaders like Dianne Feinstein had the vision to spearhead this project over 20 years ago, leaving an incredible gift for us all. And I just wanted to share this quote from Annie Proulx. Her book, Fen, Bog, and Swamp, came out just when I was, finishing putting my book together. And she goes into how the destruction of wetland habitats relates to our own climate emergency. And I agree with her optimism that wetland losses can be reversed, and I'm hopeful that nature can soften the shocks of change. And I see this project as a nexus between art and science, and I'm very pleased to have contributors from both sides of that, and including Elliott White, who you guys are going to meet. And those are just some of the contributors. I did want to mention, lastly, I do have a special edition of the book coming out in spring of 2024, so just next month. And this special edition will have a clamshell box and a print in it that you can only get with the special edition. So it's kind of, and the proceeds from the special edition will go to Save the Bay, which is an incredible organization founded by some women, about 50 years ago who really took seriously conservation back at a time where it wasn't really that common. And these are just a quick show of installations of the work at different venues. We're including the David Brower Institute, which I bet some people in this room are familiar with. Wonderful East Bay organization. And so books are available at the end of the talk. So thank you so much.
Okay, hello everyone. Thank you, Barbara, for allowing me to be a part of this event. I met Barbara purely through happenstance. So my student, Ireland, is in the audience right there. So Ireland is one of my PhD students, and she sent a message in our Slack channel. If you don't know what Slack is, just a communication channel, but sent a message saying, hey, there's this event going on in town. I think you all will be very interested in it. It's about wetlands photography. So I decided to go, met Barbara while she was there, started talking about what I do, my interests in wetlands and my past experiences combining art and science. And so Barbara probably did a little bit more background research on me, just a random guy she's meeting, and then invited me to contribute something. And so if you've had the chance to read the book, you've read what I contributed. And it was actually a really great opportunity for me because as a scientist, most of my communication is to peers who are thinking about the science. And it was a great opportunity for me to really get a chance to communicate to an audience that isn't in my domain, but I still want to learn, want to understand. And so I did a lot of, it was probably the toughest thing that I've ever written. And that includes my dissertation, which is over 200 pages. But this was a lot more work. And I think that kind of shows the value that I believe efforts like this can have and the value of using art to communicate complex ideas. So my presentation will not be as beautiful as Barbara's was, but hoping to bring you all to my world just a little bit with the science and how I came to this space and interact with it. So it's titled, What Came Before and What Shall Come? And the picture right here is from the Lower Swanee River National Wildlife Refuge in coastal Florida. It's where I did a lot of my dissertation research. And what you're seeing is active climate change. So these trees are being killed by saltwater intrusion, which is driven by sea level rise. And the entire ecosystem as a result is shifting with that. You're having a turnover of vegetation of the animal species that interact with certain types of vegetation. So I think it's a very good snapshot of the fact that climate change is something that we are dealing with right now, even if some of the more extreme consequences are further away. So to take you a little bit back, August 29th, 2005, the day my Earth stood still. So I'm originally from New Orleans. I was 12 years old at the time of Hurricane Katrina, and it is the most significant event in my life, both good and bad. So this is one of the biggest storms to ever make impact on an area, and one of the deadliest natural disasters the country's ever seen. But for myself, I was actually pretty safe. So many of my fellow citizens of New Orleans, some of them could not make it out, and so they were forced to kind of shelter in place. My family was very fortunate in that we had enough money to evacuate, and so I have some slides to illustrate this a little bit more cartoonishly, but I'll just speak through it. I have family that live in Galveston, Texas, which, looking at this map, Galveston is this little island. Houston is right here. So it was out of the storm's path. And my family grew up pretty poor. And so having a place to go that was free makes evacuation, or even considering evacuation, much more viable. And so we drove there. We had been there before. It's usually about 5 or 6 hour drive. On that day, was a 24-hour drive because there were so many people trying to flee the city at once. And so a lot of the time was spent sleeping in the car, waking up, knowing that you had only gone a few miles down the road. So probably the worst road trip I've ever been on. August 30th, Judgment Day. So this is the day after the storm makes landfall, and we're able to finally get imagery, so satellite imagery that's not cloudy, and also the news is finally able to start to make its way into the city. So you're an older demographic. Most of the time I give presentations at students, and some of them weren't alive at the time, and if they were, they weren't really cognizant. So you all probably remember watching the news as this was happening. At its worst, 80% of the city was flooded, which is just an extreme number to think about. And yeah, you can see as this time lapse goes on, the water level rising in the city. In some places, houses were completely covered. In other places, they weren't as affected. And you can see where I grew up. So I live on the west bank of the river in Algiers. And so my family's house was actually not severely impacted. And so many people had it much worse than we had. But what became a pretty apparent theme at the time and has become more apparent through research is that the Black and poor were often left behind and left out. And much of the media coverage at the time, it was very apparent who was left behind. And so that's a significant part of my story of the story of the Black and impoverished living in coastal areas. And coastal Louisiana is a very significant and interesting place. So when you think about wetlands across the entire US, coastal Louisiana actually has about 40% of all the coastal wetlands in the US. It's a massive number, something that you all probably didn't know ahead of time. But coastal Louisiana has been experiencing extreme rates of wetland loss. So if you look at this image, everywhere you see red is a place that used to be land and mostly wetlands that now no longer exists. It's just open water. So when you think about the coastline of any state, you think of it as this pretty static boundary, but this is actually a very dynamic boundary that contributes to some of what we're seeing going on in coastal Louisiana with respect to hurricanes. The Bay Area, while not having as many wetlands, still has wetlands that have been actively destroyed over the time of kind of European settlement of the area. And so this map shows, once again, all of the red spots are places where tidal wetlands are being restored. And if they're being restored, that means that they, for some time, weren't there. And it's pretty dominant across the South Bay, but also in other parts of the Bay where people sometimes kind of forget that it exists, the hidden parts of the Bay. And to put some numbers on this, coastal Louisiana has lost about a Delaware size of wetlands over the past 100 years. The San Francisco Bay have lost about a Rhode Island size of wetlands over the past 100 years. So about 5,000 square kilometers and about 2,000 square kilometers respectively. And why do these coastal wetlands matter? Well, they do a very good job at protecting against natural hazards that come from coastal environments. And so my journey into really wanting to study wetlands came from me reflecting on my life. Junior year, I went to my academic advisor and I said, hey, I want to get a PhD. And he was like, cool, great. What do you want to study? Hadn't really thought that far yet. So I went back to my room and I just spent some time reflecting on kind of what motivates me. I always knew I liked science and that's what I was studying, but I came to understand that for a PhD, I had to be a little more specific than I like science, I like nature. And what I started to reflect on was that turning point in my life, which was Hurricane Katrina. And then I started to think about, okay, Hurricane Katrina, Louisiana's lost a lot of wetlands. I know wetlands are good for protecting against storm surge, ecosystem service that it provides. And it just like clicked for me that if we hadn't had a century of coastal wetland loss, how much different would that storm have impacted the city? How much different would my own life have been, including millions of others? And so that spark really lit the fire that became what my career is. Because from that moment, my goal of getting a PhD, going further in science, was to understand coastal wetland change with the idea that if I can understand it, then we can start to reverse the processes that are driving some of that decline. Sea level rise is a significant driver of wetland loss that we're seeing around the world. The global mean rate of sea level rise is about 3.4 millimeters per year. And that is faster than what many coastal areas are used to experiencing, at least in the past kind of geologic timescale consideration. The map on the right is from NOAA. Each of those arrows indicate the direction of sea level. And so places where you see an arrow going up, that's where sea level rates are the sea level is rising. And the color indicates the magnitude of that rise. So mostly focusing on the fact that the arrows are pointing up almost everywhere. It's the first takeaway. But as the colors go from a greenish to a more warm and red, the rate is higher. So looking at coastal Louisiana, we see sea level rise rates of about 10 millimeters per year, which is 3 times faster than the global average. Relative sea level rise rate, I should correct myself. Looking at the Bay Area, it's about the average, which is the green arrow. But sea level rise is still an ever-present danger. And some of the effects of sea level rise are manifested both in freshwater and saltwater ecosystems. So in these freshwater forested systems where I have done a lot of my research, with sea level rise comes salinization. And with that salinization comes the die-off of many trees in that ecosystem, and you start to transition eventually into a salt marsh. Now it's a salt marsh, it has salt in the name, so salt isn't really going to drive them to extinction unless you have a hypersaline event. But what happens with salt marsh in the sea level rise context is that they're getting exposed to much more wave energy than under normal settings. And if there's not enough sediment coming in to add to that, then the wave energy will eventually start to have what you see happening in the lower right image, where things start to calve off, and there's not really a lot that the ecosystem can do to respond to that. And what that means on longer timescales under climate change is that on average, we're going to lose wetlands. So this is some research done by Mike Oslin, where they modeled effectively wetlands around the entire US coastline to understand, okay, if this amount of sea level rise were to happen, is there actually capacity within the ecosystem for some of those wetlands to be retained or to move upslope into less hazardous areas? The x-axis shows the current amount of wetlands in that in a given location, and the y-axis shows the projections in a given location. And where you see the dots in the red, those are places where there's an expectation that we will lose wetlands. Where you see the dots in the green, there's an expectation that we will gain. Averaged all across, we're going to lose wetlands. So it's a pretty scary thought sometimes. But my original impetus for starting to understand this was really thinking about people and how people are exposed to the hazards of sea level rise. So focusing on these two figures on the left, at the top, we have a recording of high tide flooding events. And high tide flooding events are floods that are driven just by the astronomical tide and the fact that the sea is now higher, the water level is higher. So a tide where you built your entire kind of community around and it was acceptable, it was safe, now only because the sea has risen, people are experiencing flooding that they hadn't experienced before. And the number of sunny day flooding events is what it's commonly called. It's pretty high in a lot of places, particularly as you look around the Gulf Coast and even up into the Chesapeake Bay region. This second figure shows the increasing trend of those high tide flooding events. So the more red the color is, the higher or the increasing magnitude or frequency of those events. So looking around, you can see a lot of dark red dots. The Bay Area still doing okay, but that's not going to be maintained through time. And these two images, I think, do a very good job of highlighting that because of the somewhat slow rate of sea level rise, you don't have these events where people just have to move and never return there. It's become this very chronic issue that people are just adapting to and not necessarily getting out of the way of. So Philadelphia, people don't really think of Philadelphia as a coastal city, but it is a coastal city and they're experiencing the impacts of sea level rise. Miami, Florida, people do think it's a coastal city, and it is a coastal city, but you have people where, hey, this woman's probably just trying to make a short commute to the grocery store, to the drugstore. And because of high tide flooding, this is just part of her normal day now. This is not an exceptional experience for her at this point. And environmental change is not distributed equally. So even though climate change is something that the entire planet is experiencing, we know that there are groups of people who are experiencing it in a slightly different way. And so this figure shows the environmental risk that FEMA has assessed for the entire country. The more red, the more environmental risk there is. So looking at places like Houston, South Florida, and even the Bay Area, there's a lot of environmental risk associated with these different settings. And so just a little bit about me. The way that I go about doing science is to, as much as possible, try to combine these different things. So taking in my ecological knowledge of a system, really trying to understand what's the history of the environment that I'm working in. And then as I drift more into combining kind of the ecological and socioeconomic, really considering the socioeconomic systems that are at play, and then it comes together into this figure on the right, which really tries to think about how environmental processes and the human setting interact with one another and can influence one another. And so myself, I used to be a field ecologist, and I think I still am a field ecologist, but I do a lot of remote sensing and using satellite imagery now. But I've spent hundreds of hours in the field across all of the Gulf Coast, working in settings that I think many people would not step a foot in. You mentioned like walking somewhere and getting stuck. Getting stuck is the norm for me. And walking through land that is unconsolidated soil. So you take a step, your foot sinks about a foot. You take another step, you sink another foot. And that's just what you're doing all day. If you've ever tried to think about swimming through syrup, think about swimming through tar. That's like how draining it is to go such a short distance in this system. And so the reason I often think about things from a map perspective or a spatial perspective is because we all spend so much time using Google Maps, using maps to navigate and contextualize ourselves on the planet. And so the top figure is some data that I published. We don't need to get into the details of that right now. And this bottom figure is also just an example, but this shows the African-American population in coastal counties, with gray counties having a higher than national average. And so thinking about not only the drivers of environmental change on the coast, but who is experiencing it, really highlights the fact that maps can be important in that process. So with a map, you can have multiple layers and allow people to co-locate themselves in the context of an environmental problem and also make it like feel real to them. So I'm wrapping up. So maybe we can find a way to distribute this link to the people that participated, but this is a science art communication thing that I participated in as a postdoc at the University of Virginia. So at the top, first two rows, these are all artists who live on the eastern shore of Virginia, a very rural community, but a lot of connection to the coast through culture and various ways of life. At the bottom, we have some scientists, myself included, who collaborated with these artists to not only help them better understand what they have been seeing in terms of environmental change, but also help them contextualize it so that they can produce art that acts to communicate that environmental change. So this was a really great experience for me because it really highlighted that your mindset and your way of the training you have gone through can interact and influence the way that you perceive the world. So as a scientist, I look out the world and I see things in a certain way because of my training, whereas an artist may see something different because of their training. And so there's a lot that I learned from speaking to the artists about what they were seeing. And I think they also learned a lot from us as the scientists. So with that, thank you all. Yeah, I think we're going to move to Q&A.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much to Elliott and Barbara for wonderful talks. My brain is buzzing. I had prepared a number of questions for them, but I'm not sure. I might have to toss out some of those questions and start somewhere else. First, I have to say I'm delighted and honored to be here. Barbara asked me to facilitate this because we go way back. Our daughters were actually in kindergarten together, a number of years ago. That was, well, they're 16 and 17 now, so that tells you how long ago that was. And when she shared with me that Elliott was co-presenting with her, I was absolutely thrilled because Elliott and I also have a shared history. Elliott and I were members of the Stanford Impact Labs fellowship group last year, which is a group of faculty on campus who are really interested in doing science that has impact. So as you can see, Elliott has been dedicated to this in many different dimensions. I'll also share that, as you heard in the introduction, my lab here on campus is really interested in sense of place and connection to place and how that influences people's engagement in their environmental behavior. So listening to the two of you speak this afternoon, I love to see all the threads that go through this. One other thread that I'll mention is that I also have a background in art and art history. So it seems that we have the perfect trifecta of connections here, maybe more than three even. But I'd like to start by picking up on this connection to place, because both of you mentioned that, and again, that's something near and dear to me, both in terms of research as well as in my own background. So Elliott, in your essay in the book, you talk about the fact that your connection to place in Louisiana and your studying of marshes and marshlands allowed you to connect more maybe quickly or naturally to the San Francisco Bay Area and the Bay when you came here. And Barbara, you've got this long family history having grown up here, so you both got this kind of really interesting connection to this place. And I'm wondering if you could talk about how a project like this one that you've engaged in, this photographic project that also has these essays, might help other people connect with this place, or if there are other dimensions of that, the science aspect or the art aspect, that might help foster for other people this connection to place.
Yeah, so one of the things that I realized living in Silicon Valley for so long is that in many ways I'm an outlier in the sense that I have this lived history with this place. So most of the Bay Area are people from, it's a pretty transient industry, the technology industry, and a lot of times people are here for a very short amount of time, either to study here or to, work at a startup or, and then they leave and they either go back to home country or another area. So I felt at a certain point, I had this wake up call and I was like, wow, I need to be, the keeper of this history. Like I need to tell the story of the Bay because it just isn't, I would meet people who had been here just a couple years and they didn't know, about the natural history here or the what was happening. So I felt there was this strong, almost ethical responsibility to tell that story. So, yeah.
Yeah, I'll say for myself, place was something that I came to realize was important later in life. So when you become displaced, you start to realize all the aspects of that place that you didn't know were important to you. And so for me, the biggest one was food. Like, even though I was only living 6 hours away, the food culture was completely different, and that definitely had an impact on me. So I think the understanding that there are special things about a place besides the fact that, well, it has this name, so that place is special. No, there are unique things there. I think the uniqueness of the different places I go to is something that I try and learn and understand. So each time I've moved to a new place, a new city, I try and understand the context in which it's situated, because that's how I understand and interact with the people and culture there. And it's no different than the way I view things as a scientist. When I'm selecting a new field site, I have to go and really understand what's the history of things that have preceded me coming there, and how will that actually influence the way that I go about designing an experiment, designing the questions, doing the analysis, the types of things that I have to consider when I'm writing it and sharing it with the world. And so place for me has become embedded in who I am, and seeking out the local context is just a part of the way that I operate in the world.
I'm going to ask one more question now, and then I'm going to toss it to the audience for some questions. So I hope you all have your thinking caps on. Another aspect of this connection to place that we're really interested in my lab is how does a connection to place either motivate place protective behaviors, or under what conditions doesn't it motivate people to get engaged in taking care of their place? And going back to your photographs, Barbara, in some of your photographs, you have this anthropocentric gaze. You have an element of humans in them. So you showed the Meta headquarters or the old tricycles, right? And then in others, you really aren't centering the humans in them. And I find it interesting in comparison to some of your other projects where you do have people in the pictures. I'm wondering if both of you could speak to what role you see people having in a restoration project like this. So both individual people as well as the broader community in being able to undertake a restoration project as monumental as this. So thinking about that kind of agency, you mentioned agency, which I love that word. So how do you see people being able to get engaged in this kind of effort?
I'll answer first and then I'll let you finish it. Yeah, for myself, I think humans can be involved at the individual level or through organization and contributing to philanthropic organizations that are involved in these efforts. I think at the individual level, one is just learning and like being knowledgeable about what's going on, and are there simple actions that you can do to reduce your harm on something that you've now learned about. But really thinking about a restoration context, I think individual involvement is significant. Going through school, we all learn science and we start to learn about the bad things people have done to the planet. But I think at times how much of that we're exposed to really kind of it kind of pacifies us in a way and allows us to just think, well, there's so many bad things going on. Why should I get involved? And you kind of mentioned this in deciding to show the pictures in oil drums to really bring in that context and not just here's something else passing on the bus or on social media. So I think the simple power of people like actually going out and getting involved signals to those around you that, wow, like there actually is something that I could be doing. There is something that is valuable enough to my time that I'm going to go and put time in. And I think something kind of infectious can happen with that. And so oftentimes when restoration projects are being led, one of the major things that people do is how can we involve the local community in this? Because if you have that type of buy-in, then you have a supportive base that you can use to keep that work going, to potentially expand that work, or to just support the fact that it's happening. So I think individual involvement is significant in any type of restoration effort.
Yeah, so I, as an artist, I have become really aware of the fact that part of what artists do is make the invisible visible to people. And, you know, my images, you know, I have different strategies for every project that I do, depending on, you know, the subject and my relationship to the subject and what I think is important to highlight. And in the case of this project, you know, the trope of beauty was really important because, like I said in the beginning, it's my love letter to the Bay, and I want people to love the Bay as much as I do. You know, it's an extraordinary resource that, you know, had we not started this journey to, you know, restore it, it would really be a huge loss. And I think, you know, it's never just, you know, one organization or just a couple artists. It's like this whole, you know, momentum of energy, you know, and really when you do research this South Bay Salt Pond restoration, the number of stakeholders that are involved, you know, municipalities, conservation groups, legislative bodies and funding. I mean, it's amazing that we got it together. And I think now we're, you know, it's like proof. That's how I look at this book. It's like, okay, you know, in our world right now, everybody's saying we can only fight and, you know, polarize and be divisive. And that's just not a narrative that is real. It's just not true. And I think we do need, to embrace the positive things that are happening and show them off so that we can, validate the actions, that are so important.
So that's great. So it sounds like there are opportunities for both individuals as well as organizations, and then certainly at the policy level for engagement. Great. Well, we are getting close to time, I believe, but I would love to at least take one question from the audience, if anybody has a question.
Yes. So for both of you, Professor Wright and Barbara, you've talked about, the transient nature of people coming to the Bay and coming and leaving, and how hardly anyone who's here was actually born here. I mean, I was born in the East Bay and have lived almost my entire life here. And the areas that you were looking at, like Louisiana and on the East Coast, those are, to be affected by the sea level rise, are places where I would imagine people have lived, and have deep roots. So how do you put people in a place where they don't have deep roots, where they may be moving on in a couple of years, and get them to care about what happens to that place?
You really came with a tough question for me.
In the last 2 minutes.
That's a great question. I mean, I will respond with what I've seen that the project managers of the restoration they're really creating this, they're kind of highlighting the recreational aspect of the restoration. So they're really trying to get people out there, and enjoy this as a natural resource. I think that's one way.
Yeah, it's definitely tough. I think at a larger level, we have to work in an empathetic setting and try and get people to understand that you can contribute something, even if it's just a little bit, even if you're not going to be here for a long time. You can contribute to something that's greater than yourself, that will persist beyond you being there. And so I think that's how I try and communicate to people that we all kind of have access to this planet. And we have to be good stewards of it for those who come after us. And so do the best that you can. If that means that you go and do some salt marsh planting, great. If the best thing you can do is donate to an organization that can do it, then do that. But the idea of place and movement about place, it does have a role in how people feel energized to invest in a place where maybe they don't envision themselves being there forever.
Wonderful. I love that question. In our group, we try to think a lot about this idea of not only connection to place, but connection to places. And we also find that the importance of not only making these place connections, but remaking places is something that is really powerful. So in terms of the more that you get engaged in helping make and remake places, the more powerfully connected you are to others in your community, and how that can really help regenerate us as individuals and as communities. So thank you so much for that question. And thanks so much to Barbara and Elliott for these incredibly motivating talks tonight, and Barbara for your beautiful book. I really have enjoyed joining this afternoon, and I hope that all of you have a chance to look at the book. Thank you so much.